Turkey just hosted its fourth secret meeting between Russian and NATO intelligence officials in 2025. Not publicized, not announced, but confirmed through multiple diplomatic sources and later partially acknowledged when convenient for the parties involved. These meetings, happening in Istanbul with Turkish intelligence serving as intermediaries, represent something that should be impossible. Active coordination between a war-mobilized NATO alliance and Russia, which NATO officially treats as existential threat, and Turkey is the broker making it happen. Let me explain what's actually occurring throughout 2024-2025, because the scale of Turkey's intermediary role has expanded far beyond what most people realize. Turkey isn't just maintaining diplomatic relations with both Russia and NATO despite the Ukraine war. Turkey is actively serving as the essential communication channel, the negotiation venue, the sanctions workaround, the trade facilitator, and increasingly the strategic balancer, whose decisions determine whether confrontations escalate or de-escalate. The numbers reveal how comprehensive this role has become. Turkish-Russian trade throughout 2024-2025 has reached approximately $60–65 billion annually, up from roughly $35 billion before the Ukraine war. That's an 80% increase during the period when Russia is under maximum Western sanctions. Turkey has become Russia's largest or second largest trading partner, depending on how you count Chinese commerce. Simultaneously, Turkey remains NATO's second largest military with roughly 350,000 active personnel and the alliance's largest army after the United States. Turkey controls NATO's southeastern flank, the critical Bosphorus and Dardanelles Straits, and provides bases and logistics that are essential for NATO operations in the Mediterranean, Middle East, and Black Sea regions. Throughout 2024-2025, Turkey has been leveraging both positions, deep Russia ties and NATO membership, to position itself as the indispensable intermediary that both sides need, but neither side can control. And Europe has been watching with a mixture of anxiety, frustration, and grudging recognition that Turkey has accumulated strategic autonomy that makes Turkish decisions critical to European security in ways that weren't true even 5 years ago. Let me show you the specific areas where Turkey's intermediary role has been expanding throughout 2024-2025. First, grain corridor negotiations. When Russia withdrew from the Black Sea Grain Initiative in July 2023, global food prices spiked and millions in Africa and Middle East faced food insecurity. Turkey, throughout late 2023 and into 2024-2025, has been the primary broker trying to resurrect grain agreements. Turkish officials meet with Russian counterparts in Moscow and Sochi. Turkish officials meet with Ukrainian counterparts in Kiev and Istanbul. Turkey proposes terms. Russia objects. Turkey revises. Ukraine demands changes. Turkey mediates. Throughout 2024-2025, while no comprehensive grain deal has been restored to the scale of the original 2022-2023 initiative, limited grain movements have continued partly through Turkish facilitation. This gives Turkey enormous leverage. Ukraine needs grain revenues. Agricultural exports are a significant portion of Ukrainian economy and war financing. Russia can block grain exports through naval threats and port attacks. Turkey controls the straits that grain ships must transit. All parties need Turkish cooperation, and Turkey, throughout 2024-2025, has used this to extract economic and political benefits from everyone involved. Second, energy transit and trade. Turkey imports approximately 45% of its natural gas from Russia as of 2024 to 2025, making Turkey one of Russia's largest gas customers in Europe. This continues despite EU efforts throughout 2022-2024 to reduce Russian energy dependence across Europe. Turkstream pipeline brings Russian gas directly to Turkey and onwards to Hungary and Serbia. Throughout 2024-2025, this pipeline has continued operating at full capacity, providing Russia with billions in revenue and Turkey with reliable gas supply. European countries that reduced Russian gas imports face higher prices and supply constraints, while Turkey maintains cheap Russian energy. Turkey throughout 2024-2025 has been discussing expanded energy cooperation with Russia, including potential gas hub projects that would position Turkey as distribution point for Russian gas to remaining European buyers. This would give Turkey enormous leverage over European energy security while deepening Turkish-Russian economic interdependence. Simultaneously, Turkey, throughout 2024-2025, maintains energy cooperation with Azerbaijan and Central Asian producers, which Europe wants to develop as alternatives to Russian energy. Turkey controls the transit routes from Caspian region to Europe. This dual position, both Russian energy customer and transit route for Russian alternatives, gives Turkey leverage over all parties. Third, military technology and defense cooperation. Turkey, throughout 2024-2025, has maintained Turkish-Russian cooperation on the S-400 air defense system, despite this causing major crisis with NATO. Turkey purchased S-400s from Russia for approximately $2.5 billion, received delivery in 2019, and activated them despite U.S. threats. U.S. response was kicking Turkey out of the F-35 fighter program and imposing CAATSA sanctions. Throughout 2024-2025, Turkey remains excluded from F-35s and continues operating S-400s alongside NATO systems. This creates interoperability nightmares for NATO because Russian and NATO air defense systems use different frequencies and protocols. Turkey, throughout 2024-2025, has discussed potential additional Russian defense purchases, including Su-57 fighters, if Western countries continue restricting advanced weapons sales to Turkey. These discussions might be partly leveraged to extract better offers from the West, but they also reflect genuine Turkish frustration with Western partners and willingness to deepen Russian defense ties. Fourth, sanctions evasion facilitation. Turkey, throughout 2024-2025, has become one of the primary routes for Russia to evade Western sanctions. Turkish companies import goods from Europe and Asia, then re-export to Russia with Turkish labels. Russian money flows through Turkish banks. Russian oligarchs park assets in Turkish real estate and businesses. Western officials throughout 2024-2025 have repeatedly complained to Turkey about sanctions evasion, but Turkish response has been minimal. Some token enforcement actions, but fundamentally Turkey allows the trade to continue because it benefits Turkish economy and maintains Russian goodwill. The scale is enormous. Billions of dollars in trade that should be blocked by sanctions flows through Turkey throughout 2024-2025. Everything from electronics to luxury goods to industrial machinery reaches Russia via Turkey. This makes Western sanctions less effective and helps Russian economy sustain war effort while providing Turkish middlemen with profitable business. Now let me explain what Turkey gets in return for playing this intermediary role, because Turkish calculations are rational even if they frustrate NATO partners. Economic benefits are substantial. Cheap Russian energy saves Turkey billions annually compared to market prices. Increased Russian trade provides Turkish businesses with opportunities. Sanctions evasion fees generate income. Throughout 2024-2025, Turkish economy has been struggling with high inflation, currency weakness, and fiscal pressures. Russian economic relationship provides relief that Turkey needs. Cutting off Russia would hurt Turkish economy significantly, with no guarantee that Europe would compensate Turkey adequately. Strategic autonomy is second major benefit. By maintaining both NATO membership and Russian ties, Turkey can play both sides. Turkey can threaten NATO with closer Russian alignment when NATO doesn't provide what Turkey wants. Turkey can threaten Russia with NATO coordination when Russia doesn't accommodate Turkish interests. Throughout 2024-2025, Turkey has used this dual leverage extensively. Turkey blocked Sweden's NATO membership for nearly 2 years until extracting concessions. Turkey obstructs NATO initiatives that don't serve Turkish interests. Turkey pursues military operations in Syria that NATO opposes. Turkey knows NATO can't expel Turkey without catastrophic strategic losses, so Turkey acts with impunity. Regional influence is third benefit. Turkey throughout 2024-2025 has been expanding influence in Syria, Libya, Azerbaijan, Central Asia, and Africa. Many of these initiatives require not antagonizing Russia, which has its own interests in these regions. By maintaining Russian relationship, Turkey can coordinate or at least coexist with Russian regional activities rather than constantly confronting Russian opposition. Let me show you what Europe's response has been throughout 2024-2025 and why it's been ineffective. European officials throughout 2024-2025 have oscillated between condemning Turkish behavior and trying to accommodate Turkish demands to maintain some influence. Germany throughout 2024-2025 has tried to use economic leverage. Turkey depends on German trade and investment. But Turkey has shown willingness to endure economic pressure rather than completely abandon Russian ties. German attempts to pressure Turkey have yielded minimal results. France throughout 2024-2025 has been more confrontational, with Macron making critical statements about Turkish regional policies and Russian cooperation. But French leverage over Turkey is limited. France can't offer Turkey what it needs: energy security, economic opportunities, regional influence. So French criticism is ignored. European Union throughout 2024-2025 has discussed sanctions on Turkey for various issues, including illegal drilling in Cypriot waters and human rights concerns. But actual sanctions haven't been imposed because EU recognizes that alienating Turkey would push Turkey fully into Russian alignment, which would be even worse for European security. So European response throughout 2024-2025 has been mostly symbolic complaints while grudgingly accepting that Turkey will maintain Russian relationship regardless of European preferences. Europe watches closely because Turkish decisions affect European interests. But Europe can't effectively constrain Turkish behavior. Subscribe to this channel if you want continued coverage of how Turkey's expanding intermediary role develops through 2026, because mainstream European media often downplays the significance to avoid highlighting NATO divisions. Now let me explain what Russia gets from this relationship with Turkey. Economic lifeline is primary benefit. With Western markets largely closed due to sanctions, Russia throughout 2024-2025 needs alternative trade routes and partners. Turkey provides both: direct trade worth $60+ billion annually and transit routes for Russian goods to reach Middle East and Africa. Russian energy exports continue flowing to Turkey throughout 2024-2025. Generating billions in revenue that sustains Russian budget and war effort. Without Turkish and other remaining customers, Russian energy revenues would collapse much further than they have. Sanctions evasion facilitation by Turkey throughout 2024-2025 allows Russia to import critical goods, electronics, machinery, luxury items that Russia can't produce domestically and can't easily import directly from sanctioning countries. This helps Russian economy function and Russian elites maintain lifestyles, which reduces domestic pressure on Putin regime. Strategic leverage within NATO is second benefit. Having Turkey as NATO member that maintains Russian ties creates divisions within NATO that Russia can exploit. Russia throughout 2024-2025 has used Turkish NATO tensions to argue that NATO is weakening and fracturing, even though this overstates actual divisions. Russia throughout 2024-2025 knows it can't pull Turkey completely out of NATO, but maintaining relationship ensures Turkey doesn't fully align with NATO anti-Russian policies. Turkey's independent stance on Ukraine, providing some military aid to Ukraine but refusing to join sanctions, and maintaining Russian ties, serves Russian interests by preventing NATO unity. Regional coordination is third benefit. Russia and Turkey have overlapping interests in Syria, Libya, Caucasus, and Central Asia. Throughout 2024-2025, rather than constantly conflicting, Russia and Turkey have coordinated to divide spheres of influence and manage situations to mutual benefit. Syria is primary example. Turkey controls northwestern Syria. Russia supports Assad government in Damascus. Throughout 2024-2025, despite supporting opposing sides, Turkey and Russia coordinate to prevent escalation and manage the conflict in ways that both can live with. This coordination wouldn't be possible without the broader Turkish-Russian relationship. Let me show you what specific incidents throughout 2024-2025 reveal about Turkey's expanded intermediary role. Prisoner exchanges between Russia and Ukraine throughout 2024-2025 have often been facilitated through Turkish mediation. Turkey provides neutral ground for negotiations and logistical support for exchanges. Each successful exchange gives Turkey credit with both sides and reinforces Turkish position as essential broker. Turkey throughout 2024-2025 has facilitated several major exchanges involving hundreds of prisoners, including some involving third countries like the UK and US. Peace negotiation attempts throughout 2024-2025, while unsuccessful so far in achieving comprehensive settlement, have repeatedly featured Turkish involvement. Turkey hosted early negotiations in March-April 2022 in Istanbul and Antalya. Throughout 2024-2025, when discussions of renewed negotiations emerge, Turkey is always mentioned as potential venue and mediator. This positioning as indispensable peace broker gives Turkey influence over terms and timing of any eventual settlement. Both Russia and Ukraine know they'll likely need Turkish involvement in serious negotiations, which gives Turkey leverage to shape outcomes toward Turkish interests. Humanitarian corridors and civilian evacuations throughout 2024-2025 have sometimes involved Turkish coordination. When Mariupol fell to Russia in 2022, Turkey was involved in evacuation negotiations. Throughout 2024-2025, various smaller-scale evacuations and humanitarian initiatives have featured Turkish facilitation. This creates perception that Turkey is pragmatic humanitarian actor, while NATO is militarized and Russia is aggressive, positioning Turkey as reasonable middle ground that both can work with. Now let me tell you what NATO's strategic dilemma is regarding Turkey throughout 2024-2025. NATO needs Turkey desperately. Geographic position controlling Bosphorus, second largest military, bases in Incirlik and elsewhere supporting operations. Without Turkey, NATO's southeastern flank collapses and Mediterranean strategy becomes extremely difficult. But Turkey throughout 2024-2025 is increasingly unreliable from NATO perspective, won't fully support Ukraine, maintains deep Russian ties, obstructs alliance decisions, pursues regional policies that conflict with US and European interests, threatens to block new members, uses NATO unanimity requirement as leverage for Turkish demands. NATO's dilemma is that expelling Turkey would be worse than tolerating Turkish behavior. Expulsion would push Turkey into Russian alignment, give Russia access to Bosphorus cooperation, eliminate NATO's position in critical geography, and create hostile power on NATO's flank. So NATO, throughout 2024-2025, has chosen to tolerate Turkish independence and try to manage relationship rather than confront Turkey. This means accepting that NATO member is simultaneously NATO's second largest military and Russia's close economic and strategic partner. This contradiction undermines alliance cohesion but seems unavoidable given geography and Turkish leverage. Let me explain what happens if Turkey's intermediary role continues expanding through 2026-2027. Turkey could become the primary venue for any comprehensive Russia-Ukraine peace negotiations if they occur. This would give Turkey enormous influence over settlement terms and massive prestige as peacemaker. Turkey could expand economic role with Russia, potentially reaching $80–100 billion in bilateral trade by 2027 if current trends continue. This would make Russia-Turkey economic interdependence even deeper and Turkish incentives to maintain Russian ties even stronger. Turkey could extract more concessions from both NATO and Russia by playing them against each other. Turkey demanding advanced weapons from NATO while threatening Russian defense purchases. Turkey demanding energy discounts from Russia while threatening closer NATO coordination. Both sides might pay to keep Turkey somewhat aligned with their interests. Turkey could formalize role as neutral intermediary between West and Russia more broadly, not just on Ukraine, but on various issues. Turkey hosting talks on arms control, regional conflicts, trade disputes. Turkey becoming the Switzerland of NATO, formally allied but functionally neutral and willing to deal with anyone. By 2027, Turkey might be so deeply embedded as essential broker between NATO and Russia that both sides depend on Turkish mediation for any serious negotiations, giving Turkey veto power over East-West relations that rivals U.S. or major European countries. Now, let me tell you what I personally think is happening beneath the surface. Turkey under Erdogan throughout 2024-2025 has pursued neo-Ottoman strategy of expanding Turkish influence across regions that were once Ottoman Empire. This requires balancing relationships with multiple great powers rather than exclusively aligning with one. Turkey throughout 2024-2025 has concluded that exclusive NATO alignment constrains Turkish regional ambitions because U.S. and Europe oppose many Turkish goals, influence in Syria, Libya, Cyprus, Eastern Mediterranean. By maintaining Russian ties, Turkey gains freedom to pursue these ambitions without constant Western obstruction. Russia, throughout 2024-2025, has encouraged Turkish independence because it weakens NATO and provides Russia with access to NATO member for trade and coordination. Russia doesn't expect to pull Turkey completely away from NATO, but keeping Turkey semi-detached serves Russian interests. NATO, throughout 2024-2025, has been paralyzed by inability to either satisfy Turkish demands or expel Turkey. This paralysis allows Turkey to keep expanding intermediary role because neither NATO nor Russia can force Turkey to choose sides. The result is Turkey accumulating strategic autonomy throughout 2024-2025 at a rate that's unprecedented for a NATO member, fundamentally changing what NATO membership means in the 21st century. Turkey is proving that if you control critical geography and maintain relationships with multiple great powers, you can be in an alliance while simultaneously pursuing independent strategy that often contradicts alliance positions. Turkey's role between Russia and NATO expanding throughout 2024-2025 across trade, $60+ billion Russian bilateral commerce, energy, 45% gas imports from Russia, defense, S-400 systems plus cooperation, diplomatic mediation, grain deals, prisoner exchanges, peace negotiation hosting, and sanctions evasion, billions flowing through Turkey to Russia. Europe watches very closely throughout 2024-2025 because Turkish decisions on Straits access, energy transit, sanctions enforcement, and NATO coordination all directly affect European security. But Europe can't control Turkish behavior because Turkey has leveraged geographic position and dual relationships to achieve autonomy that European pressure can't override. As 2025 ends, Turkey continues deepening Russian economic ties while maintaining NATO membership. Turkey continues blocking some NATO initiatives while participating in others. Turkey continues positioning itself as essential intermediary that both sides need, but neither side controls. European security throughout 2025 has become partially dependent on Turkish decisions that can't be predicted or guaranteed. Whether Turkey will support NATO positions, whether Turkey will enforce sanctions, whether Turkey will allow military transit, whether Turkey will mediate conflicts in ways that serve European interests. The expanding role is real, the leverage is growing, and European recognition that Turkey is sometimes ally, sometimes neutral, sometimes competitor, depending on issue, and Turkish interest is fundamentally altering European security calculations about what NATO membership means and how alliance unity can be maintained when critical member pursues increasingly autonomous strategy. That's late 2025. Turkey balancing between Russia and NATO with skill and determination that maximizes Turkish influence. Both sides need Turkish cooperation more than Turkey needs exclusive alignment with either. And Europe watches closely while grudgingly accepting that Turkish intermediary role will continue expanding because geography, economics, and strategic positioning give Turkey power that European preferences can't negate.